Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Behind Company Lines podcast. Today we have Jeff Fernandez, CEO and co-founder of Dandi. Dandi is the analytics platform for advancing DEI. Jeff, I'm so excited to chat with you, not only to chat about your background and your experience, but also where kind of the industry is going in terms of DEI. I think not only, first of all, tech companies, I think, popularized the whole focus and focal point around diversity and inclusion, but it's expanded, and I think a lot of companies are seeing the benefits. So obviously, we'll dive into what those benefits are and how we can kind of better as companies understand our own DEI and also lead programs and lead movements within our organizations to improve those metrics as well. But before we get into all that, what were you doing before you started the company?
Yeah. So first and foremost, Julian, thanks so much for having me on. Excited to be here. Thanks so much. What was I doing before Dandi? So before Dandi, I had started a company back in 2010 called Grovo, where we were pioneers in online microlearning, where we created short videos providing training and learning for digital software and skills. We created thousands of them and housed them in a software. And so we sold that software and content to larger organizations, mid-market and enterprises. And so we ran that for about 7 or 8 years and grew to a couple hundred employees. And eventually it was acquired by Cornerstone OnDemand, which was then a publicly traded learning company. So the inspiration for Dandi actually happened back in 2014, 2015, when we would export the data from our HR systems and then put it into a spreadsheet, and we'd pivot table it and we'd eyeball for parity. And we'd look at things like promotion rates and attrition rates and comp gaps. And we'd take a look at the employee base and see if folks were potentially being treated unfairly or differently. And so when we saw that, we'd step in and we'd fix it. But it was hard, it was slow. It was manual. It was really time consuming. So a handful of us got together and said, let's go create an API first software, right? Built in the cloud that does this for folks off the shelf. And that was how Dandi was born.
It's so fascinating. Was that kind of a function of the business at the time, or did you kind of think about, all this data we're collecting, there might be something interested in it, and then you kind of keyed in on being able to try to see trends? Was it part of the business model at the time, or was it kind of an auxiliary thing that you were collecting and trying to understand a little more?
I mean, we were always using a lot of the best-in-class tools for HRIS at the time. We used Bamboo for applicant tracking system. We used Greenhouse, which again, we were a couple hundred employees, but we wanted to build a great place to work. And part of how we wanted to do so was to be quantitative about it. So that was really the inspiration. And this was before DEI, I think, had become popularized, which sadly came after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in 2020. But this was well before that. It was just, hey, let's take a quantitative look at the folks that we employ and the folks that we might employ, and how could we potentially do a better job to create a better workplace?
Yeah. And what was I don't want to say inspiration, but why was it such a focal point to you as an individual? I think it like you said, there was a few different catalysts for creating a company and for it to be a little bit more focused on internally broadly. But for you in particular, as an individual, was there an experience or was there anything in particular that you were like, I think things need to be a better working environment and we need to have a lot more diverse individuals on our team?
Yeah. Well, for me, so first and foremost, I have to recognize my privilege, right? I get to walk around effective as a white man, right? Cis white man in the world. So my experience of this is certainly different than other folks, right? But I just walked around the world in my own observations, right? I'd walk into having meetings and a system would come out looking for Jeff Fernandez and oftentimes expected someone to look differently than I do. And so it's a really small, inconsequential example of what folks, right, along the lines of what folks experience every day. So we wanted to try to recognize what that looked like and the manifestation of that potentially in the workplace. And knowing full well that we probably could do a much better job than we were doing. And I think we discovered that, and we just continued to try to do better and better on it every day. So really it felt like not only the right thing to do, but also a good business choice. Folks really wanted to join and be a part of the company because of it too, even though we had our problems that we were working out every day as well. But we made it relatively central to how we tried to operate.
Yeah. And when you were going through this discovery process, what were some interesting findings or even alarming findings that you were seeing, whether it was at your company or the clients that you were servicing, that showed the disparity between either whether it's cultural background, gender, experience? What were you seeing? What outcomes were you like, things need to change, things need to shift, companies need to start focusing on the impact of this in particular? Anything come to mind?
Yeah. I like to think about this as parts of the employee life cycle, because all parts of the employee life cycle interact. And as we think about it at Dandi, we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And diversity is up at the top of the funnel. So this is really your recruiting and your hiring and your workforce representation. All right. So you think about the disparities that happen there, and we just rolled out a new part of our software for recruiting that does this really well. Is it shows the likelihood of a particular group of people from being passed from, let's say, from the phone screen stage of recruiting to an in-person interview. So you could see, let's say, how Black women compared to white men, as an example, are experiencing different pass-through rates. Okay.
Yeah.
And so you oftentimes see disparities there. Same thing with hiring. Same thing, right? Then with your workforce representation more broadly. Next is equity. And equity is how you treat people. Okay. So this is, you think about more traditional compensation bias, right? And it's not just base salaries. It's also equity and commissions and bonuses and total comp. Then promotion rates as well. Yeah. And you have to think about metrics. How do you define this stuff? How do you define a promotion, which we do for customers in the platform? And then also career mobility. Yeah. So this is really how you treat people. And so a lot of stories, in my experience of working with organizations, when you do compensation and promotion rate analysis, what you're going to see is that there can be a pretty stark set of differences. And there's no other sometimes to identify the root cause. And folks will say, what about performance? And that's the last part of equity. So when you look at performance scores, this is where you'll oftentimes see relatively large disparities as well, where underrepresented groups are in fact receiving lower performance scores. And I'm sure there's some cases where that's merited, but blanket across the board, it certainly isn't. And so we're able to take a look at that first before taking a look at the rest of compensation and promotions, because that gives you a lot more nuance and sophistication to understand what's happening at the organization. And the final piece is inclusion. And inclusion is how people feel and when they vote with their feet. In other words, it's sentiment. With all the surveys that folks collect, how do you feel about the organization? Do you think you'll be here in 2 years? Do you like your manager? Things of that variety or sentiment. Next is attrition and retention. Right? What is the likelihood that you are going to be at the organization? Have you left the company, et cetera? Ultimately, that is the final test. And so all parts of this work together in one big system, right? Because if you don't do performance scores well, then ultimately there's bias there that impacts your promotion rates, that impacts your compensation gaps. That then impacts attrition, and attrition then comes back and makes it hard to recruit folks and keep folks at the organization. So it's all one big system.
Yeah. And how do you kind of balance the line between when you're thinking about one piece that was interesting was like performance scores, right? And a lot of that can be subjective and objective, depending on how you collect the data, depending on how you interpret it. How do you balance between the kind of going all in on data and just kind of measuring outcomes and measuring employees between those versus having more subjective kind of measures, how this employee interacts with their team, how this employee makes other employees feel? How do you kind of balance those to really kind of get a holistic view? And is there anything broken in that system to then kind of be alarmed by this signal of a disparity between these two groups of people being underrepresented and not?
Yeah, so you make a great point, and one that we encourage our customers always to pursue a dual-pronged approach. One of which is very much focused on quote unquote job performance, right? Are you achieving the stated outcomes, right? At the same time, the other half of that, to your point, is more cultural. And how are you interacting with your team, et cetera? And oftentimes you will judge these in the same ways and ideally use the same measuring stick. So let's say a 1 to 5 measuring score, right? Having both of these together enlightens what's happening for different employees in a really meaningful way. Because what you're able to do then is take a look at distribution graphs and see what the distribution looks like across the underrepresented groups, but then also run regression analyses to see if the differences in the performance scores, either by job performance or by cultural performance or interactions, are different, and should they be different? And oftentimes what you see in those cases is that's just not the case. And sometimes it's widespread. Other times it's really localized in different parts of the organization. And we take a very a train first sort of mentality, right? Assume that folks don't mean to do this intentionally if they are.
Sure.
Right? Provide the training and the coaching to make sure that they know to do it differently, right? Yeah. So that's how we approach it. Both are really important.
Yeah. And thinking about that piece, which is rather than thinking about what's wrong or what's broken in the system or who are the bad actors, I think the assumption that people are mean well, it gives you a little bit more freedom to find solutions. And I'm curious, when you kind of go through this analysis, what are the high performers doing that, are maybe different or disconnected from the lower performers, regardless of their background? And how can we get everyone to a certain level? Is it better measurable? Is it better management kind of structure? What can we do as companies to be able to train up our employees to, weed out any kind of thought of bad actors or anything like that?
Yeah, that's right. It's meant to be it's meant to shine a light on what's going on in the organization in a really positive way, because it benefits all people when done properly. And so that's the approach that we take. And I think our customers certainly appreciate that as well.
Yeah. And I heard one of a few, actually, the guests I've been on the show, they have really high success rates in terms of the diversity of their team and diversity of skill set, regions and things like that. And they kind of set that expectation on a foundational level from the start of their business, and making sure that that's a very clear focal point of theirs. But you don't see companies all doing that, because everyone has a different problem set, whether it's trying to find a product market fit, trying to address their overall market, or maybe it's a go-to-market strategy. But what in particular have you seen other companies that maybe don't set those expectations? How do they then kind of reinvest and restructure diversity and inclusion, so that equity inclusion, so that they can actually have higher performing outcomes? What have been some successful strategies?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, because the answer to that is there's no better day than today.
Sure.
Right. So it doesn't matter whether you got started on day 1 or it's year 10, right? Get started today. And so I think the playbook looks something like, first, right, understand, like you would for any business function. Ultimately, let's start with the data. What's actually happening at the organization with our people when we look at it through the lens of DE&I, right? And that's just a more intersectional view of people analytics, right?
Yeah.
So first and foremost, let's establish what's happening quantitatively by the data. 1. 2, then let's identify where we're doing well and where we're not doing well. Do a proper SWOT analysis. The same thing that we do if this were a marketing organization or if this was a sales organization. We would do it the same way, right? Treat it like a business function. Number 3, once we understand where we're doing well and where we're not, number 3 is set goals, right? Where do we want to improve? And let's do so in a quarterly and annual format. And also be reasonable about what we can achieve over that time increment, right? If you say, let's get to for 80% men and 20% women, and you're saying that that's a priority for you to hire more women, let's say, you're not going to be at parity by the end of the year. You will not be 50-50. Mathematically, it's entirely unlikely that that's going to happen, right? But how do we set a goal that's reasonable? And when we do the intersectional work there, when we say hire women, do we mean women from underrepresented groups as well? Let's go make sure that it's scaffolded properly. And then I think one of the most important things is number 4 and number 5, which is be transparent. Let's put the dashboards out in front of the organization at a level to which leadership's comfortable. And let's do that every quarter and track the progress. Again, no different than you would any other business function.
Right. And thinking about one thing that kind of, I think companies who reflect on the systems in place and thinking about the talent pool, one interesting stereotype that I've seen is that, or I've heard, is that people come from underrepresented backgrounds, have less, say, traditional backgrounds. And for example, if you're, say, a software engineer, you can maybe see somebody from an underrepresented background or coming from boot camps, kind of doing projects, kind of building up their skill set that way. And then others who come from, say, higher level institutions, maybe have internship and then go into whatever position. 2 very different backgrounds in the scene. But is it actually that? Are we seeing that people from underrepresented groups are coming from less structured backgrounds or less traditional backgrounds, and that creates kind of a more sophisticated way to evaluate talent? Or is that just not the case?
I think that's tough to say. I think ultimately we're moving to a more skills-based climate and economy for job seekers and employers. And so I think over time, you're going to see a trend in that direction versus degrees, 4-year degrees, I think, that provide blanket credibility. I think you're going to see much more focused, skill-based accreditation. I don't spend my time working on solving that problem. So there are folks who can certainly answer the question better than I can, I think. But I think that's the movement.
Yeah. And just give us, for the audience, give us a little bit of insight. What kind of traction have you seen in the last few years? What's gotten you excited about that? But what in particular are you excited about in terms of the next wave of Dandi?
Yeah, so I appreciate that. So we got started in early 2018, and we decided, based off the inspiration from our last company, to take our time and build software that we thought customers would love. And so we were stealth and bootstrapped for 4 years. Last year, we raised an institutional round of seed financing led by Spring Bank and Alley Corp here in New York City. And so, but for 4 years, we were bootstrapped, noses down, and got to a few dozen customers. And we said to ourselves internally, we have 6 co-founders at Dandi, which is not exactly traditional, but we each bring something really different to the table, and we were bootstrapping, and we wanted to construct the organization that way. But we always said if you got to a few dozen customers, some of which were companies that customers would recognize, that we would then raise capital and get out to the world. So now for us, it's, as we look at 2023, it's focused on 2 primary things. One, as always, build software that customers love. That includes, we just released goals, which is super exciting. We've got new roles and permissions coming, new tracking with alerts, a lot of really new exciting things. And then number 2 is grow, right? And serve more employees and more customers, more employees, and get to servicing a couple million employees by the end of this year. Because ultimately, one of the most important metrics for us internally is what we like to call PI, is positively impacted employees. So for us, growth means we're helping, knock on wood, right? We are helping the world more.
Yeah. And who manages the technology? If I'm a client or potential customer and I want to bring in a solution like this, it's a whole nother platform. And obviously, without interpreting data and creating actions and having somebody kind of accountable for that, that things don't move forward. Who is that individual at companies who is not only a champion maybe, but also a major stakeholder and who cares enough about these outcomes to create changes in the organization to do something about it?
Yeah, so the person responsible at every organization is an HR person who does DEI or the DEI leader. And ideally, there's a dedicated DEI leader. At smaller organizations, sometimes it's a blend, right? Invariably, DEI partners with the HR team. And so you typically have your VP of HR and your Chief People Officer in partnership then with other functional groups within the HR team, the performance team, the compensation team, the recruiting and talent teams. Now, they all have different dashboards, different views, because they're looking at different metrics in different parts of the employee life cycle, but they all have their own dashboards with their own points of view and different reports that appear in those sections. From there, we get the broader executive team involved. And just recently, in the last 6 to 9 months, we actually had a handful of organizations create dashboards for the entire company. All employees get a view of really high-level KPIs. That's how we think about the rollout. It kind of goes in those phases. And the larger the organization, the more likely they are to have all of those different constituencies represented and with dashboards inside of Dandi.
Yeah. And thinking about the outcomes a little bit more, say you have Dandi, you have this person who's responsible for these outcomes, and then you start to make changes. If I'm a company that say doesn't buy or hesitates or isn't focusing on this, what are some ways that my company will be impacted negatively by not focusing on having a I guess, more representative working organization and teams to the world? I kind of view diversity, equity, and inclusion in that respect. It's just a representation of the world, and having that in your company is just more beneficial. But what are some of the negative outcomes, and what are some of the positive outcomes that come out of focusing on this?
Yeah. So I think organizations like McKinsey, the Boston Consulting Group, and Deloitte have done research for a couple of decades now that have confirmed quantitatively that doing DEI well for the largest organizations in the world delivers meaningfully improved revenue outcomes, profitability outcomes, and also employee productivity outcomes, all of which, right, change the way the organization does business, right? So it's better for business to do DEI well. And I think it's hard to say specifically why without very specific examples, but as we think about why that might be the case, having different points of view in the room helps us get to better solutions. more quickly.
Yeah.
And you consider more when different kinds of folks are in the room and everyone has a voice and feels comfortable speaking openly. And so you see that was true back when if you ever did group projects as a kid. It was the case then.
Yeah.
It's the case today too.
Yeah. And just thinking about companies who are focusing on it and who aren't, who still has ground to make up? How many companies are, say, not focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, who should be, and what are the differences? Obviously, there's successful business outcomes, but in terms of maybe attraction of talent, what are some differences that you see between companies who aren't and who are outside what you just said?
Yeah, well, certainly I think everyone should be, right? I think the ones that are, the number one outcome that we're seeing is that companies today who are focused on DEI are attracting Gen X talent, Gen Z talent, at an incomparable rate compared to those that aren't. Gen Z cares deeply about DEI, and they want to see your DEI programs and your outcomes and your annual reporting front and center on your website. And so if you're not doing the work and you're not communicating the results of the work, it's becoming increasingly difficult for organizations to compete for talent, especially Gen Z talent. So I'd say that right now is probably the biggest fork in the road that we're seeing outside of the obvious business outcomes.
Yeah. And whether you think about it internally or externally, what are some of the biggest challenges that Dandi faces today?
Well, I think right now, diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, it's going through a transformative moment. The murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the events of 2020, what we saw was an explosion of DEI practitioners. There are more chief diversity officers today than there ever were before. Yeah. However, the turnover is also the highest, is what we're seeing. And I think that's in large part because the function isn't necessarily as defined as it should be. In other words, what is the mission? And what are the KPIs? What are the metrics? And how is that executive meant to interact with other executives at the organization? And so without the foundation of that, without that definitional foundation, I think it becomes pretty challenging to state what the business function is meant to achieve. Yeah. And so that right now is one of the toughest things, but it's also one of the most exciting things for us. We're helping chief diversity officers and DEI managers, et cetera, navigate what that landscape looks like and help to create what the role should be or what it could be. And so I think that's really exciting. It's this fork in the road moment where the community of practitioners are pulling together. At the same time, right, DEI budgets are being cut in a lot of organizations. That said, at many organizations, they're not being cut and they're actually being expanded because some organizations realize that this is the opportunity, right, again, from a business perspective, to get really good at DEI to compete for the Gen Z talent. So we're parsing through what that looks like so we can help those organizations and those DEI leaders achieve the best results.
Yeah. And if you think about if everything goes well, what's the long-term vision for Dandi?
Yeah, so I think what we really want to do over time is, to your point earlier, is DEI is a business function. And how can we connect DEI quantitatively to the business results? And said crassly almost as ROI, right? Is how do we know that when you've done X, Y, and Z DEI programs, or you've taken certain actions, what has that translated to for the company, for the business, right?
Yeah.
And how are people's experiences improved that much? And over time, how are we contributing to folks' careers, right? Companies that are doing DEI well, for individuals over 10, 15, 20 years of their careers, how has that affected the trajectory of their careers? And I think that's really interesting.
So fascinating to see the overall impact and also that the numbers support a lot of the reasons for wanting to invest in DEI and a lot of the motivation behind it, not only just retention and gaining talent, but also business outcomes and what it means for your customer base and the clients and those revenue targets that you want to hit. I mean, I've heard time and time again, and obviously my own experience, it's so much more expensive to hire than fire somebody versus hire somebody that you really like and you really want on the team, and then train them and create an environment for them to stay and improve and progress in their career, because, you know, it's almost way more cost effective in a lot of different ways. So getting that part is so important. I always like this next section. I call it my founder FAQ. So I'm going to hit you with some rapid fire questions and see what we get. Wow. But first, just to open it up, outside of prioritization, because a lot of founders say this, but what's particularly hard about your job today?
Particularly hard about my job today. We're a seed funded company. And this is one of those moments I joke around with the team where my job as CEO of the company, right? It's always kind of around the same pillars, right? Focus on financing the company, making sure we're capitalized, right? Strategy, the core strategy of the business, recruiting, getting great people, the culture of the business, and then pick one of the function areas that I spend time. I like to spend time on the go-to-market, right? So that's my job. But right now, this is one of those moments in company building where I, as CEO, I'm doing many jobs, right? I'm an HR person, I do payroll, and I clean the office. And not to say that I mind doing any of those things, I don't. But it's one of those moments where I'm doing a lot of stuff at once, right? That are very disparate. So I have 2 young kids, my daughter Remy and my son Rafa and my wife Corey. I'm trying to balance being a really good dad and a good husband and all of that with the requirements of the job means that I need to be very focused whenever I'm doing any one of those things. So yeah, that's usually how it feels, is do this thing intensely well for now and before I transition my focus to the next thing.
Yeah. And thinking about, you mentioned bootstrapping for 4 years, and a lot of founders talk about that kind of experience or that timeline versus going out and just gaining new customers and trying to find product market fit. What were you doing during that bootstrapping time? And for other founders who find themselves in the midst of it, obviously it's challenging, right? You might not be making as much revenue, or you might not have the projections or have the team, or maybe you have to do a lot of different things that in maybe looking in slow growth down, but maybe looking out, you're defining a strong product market fit or defining technology. What were you doing during that time? And for other founders in the midst of it, how do I not go crazy and maintain that level of motivation and energy to continue improving my product for when it's time to kind of launch into other markets or upstream?
Yeah. So I'll start with the second question is, because I think it fuels the first. So I think the way that you maintain your motivation, which for me has never been necessarily that hard. I've always been, I think, pretty motivated and work-oriented. I'm over-oriented towards work. That said, I don't think I could do it if I didn't have my co-founders and the people that are very much in our corner. So our co-founder CTO, Mamdu, and Siraj, our co-founder VP Engineering, and Brian Shell, our VP of Revenue, and so our co-founder VP of Revenue. So these people around the table that for me, right, sometimes I need to lift up and sometimes they lift me up, but we keep each other going. It's okay to have a bad day sometimes, but we keep each other going. At the same time, we're really fortunate to have our partners in our lives because they are also enormously supportive. So I think advice to founders would be, it's kind of cliche, but find the people that you care about, right? And find the people that care about you. That's really what matters. I think in the early days, to answer your question specifically about what we were doing, I think there's R&D side of the business, and then there's the go-to-market side of the business. So the R&D side of the business was a really small team that built a lot of software. So they were spending more time probably behind their screens or in front of their screens, if you will, than they probably would have liked. They were building a lot quickly. Whereas the go-to-market folks, we were out and about having conversations with folks. And our co-founder, Elise James de Cruz, introduced us very early on to a handful of DI leaders that were enormously influential and helpful for us. Elise introduced us to folks like Elise O'Leary and Carol Watson. And those folks really shaped how we thought about the problems we were solving and the solutions that we needed to create. And so for us, it was about gaining clarity, right? About what the function needed and how we could build software that would be really scalable as we were learning.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier a little bit about certain things in companies are seeing budget cuts and others are not. And thinking about just overall kind of, we talked about the markets leaning towards a skills-based kind of evaluation or kind of measuring those as the level of importance when looking at talent. In regards to companies who are kind of developing or building their strategies, what are some ways that they can evaluate skills more efficiently, more effectively, and more accurately for their job function, rather than if I'm looking for a React developer, for instance, and I want to see some projects, some web pages that they've built, and that's a little bit more cut and dry. But for other job functions that are less so, what are some ways companies can measure those skills and in comparison to what they need internally, rather than what's qualified in the market?
You know what? At our last company, I interacted with some folks who were trying to solve that problem, and I'm not sure how you do it and how you do it really well. I think folks are still working on solving that problem now. And so I think LinkedIn is working on it. I think Degreed is working on it, and many others are working on it.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure. I think maybe we should get them on the next show.
Yeah, 100%. What are some ways that, I know you're building a lot of tools to uncover the analytics behind companies and kind of see not only their outcomes, but find ways to improve. What are some ways that companies can better track outside of Dandi to whether support the product better? What's some way that companies can start tracking their diversity, equity, and inclusion so that when they do get a solution like Dandi, it could be that much more effective for their goals?
I think one of the most important things, Julian, is think about the data that you have and the data that you want to have. For example, right? In today's environment, a lot of folks are working from home. Or you might have some folks that work hybrid. You might have other folks that work in the office every day, all day. Yeah. Maybe you want to collect that information, right? And store that in your HRIS, right? Or in a data lake if you have Snowflake or something else, right? So that when you start doing DI work, if you're not already doing it, you can take a look at how your hiring or your attrition or your promotion rates, especially promotion probably on that one, compensation rates might be different for those different categories of worker, right? And then if you break it down intersectionally and take a look at underrepresented groups who are remote, perhaps you're going to see a pretty meaningful disparity.
Yeah.
So I always like to think about what are the data fields that we should be collecting based on what's happening today and how do we go get them?
Yeah. Yeah. And just out of curiosity, what would be those data sets that you would find important if you're working with, or if you're managing a team that's remote and thinking about their personal circumstances and how they affect their outcomes and productivity?
So I think working status, right? Like, are you remote? Are you hybrid? I think that one matters quite a bit. I think in that context too, we've seen a lot of companies want to collect parental status and caregiver status, right? Those two, because they couple really nicely, right, with the working status scenario, right? So folks want to collect those as well right now. Yeah. That gives them, I think, insight into productivity and how they can better compensate those folks and make sure there's no disparities there.
Yeah. Outside of say roles that are performance based, so obviously sales roles can kind of equalize in terms of not only salary but commission and compensation and things like that. I think there's a little bit more freedom to identify ways that you can support better performers, but also evaluate the lower performers. But outside of those roles that are performance based, say whether it's engineering or someone where it's product design that, has less consistent measurable outcomes, what are some ways that companies can compensate equally? And meaning that, as we said in the top of the funnel in the recruiting process and also in the equity process, like you mentioned, not only the people you're attracting and who passes through, but also then the contracts, right? What you're agreed to paying them versus the level of service that you're requiring from them. But then there's an inequity there. How can companies better compensate and how can people better advocate for themselves so that whether to close that gap in disparity?
Yeah, so I think it comes down to, first of all, as an organization, be clear about your compensation philosophy. What do you care about, right? Is it department, job level, job title, right? Tenure? What are the inputs into your compensation philosophy? Number one. Number two, are you collecting those? Number three, are they up to date? Right. And then number four is like, hey, let's go run a linear regression analysis and see if our compensation philosophy is holding true. And if there are gaps for how we're paying folks, right? And so if there are gaps, then we should probably aim to address them. And so that's usually the approach. And it's not a set and forget it ultimately, right? Anytime one person comes into the company or another person leaves the company, actually all the numbers move around a little bit, right? So our suggestion is, right, this is why you have a software like Dandi, is that it's running the analytics for you, right, all the time. so that you can you can track it and understand exactly where the gaps are, not just for comp, but for everything else in the employee life cycle as well. So yeah.
And I know a few last minute questions here, but I always like to think about how founders and ask questions around how founders extract knowledge out of anything that they ingest. I always think it's so unique and so interesting to see the anecdotes that they come up with. But whether it was early in your career or now, what books or people have been the most influential, most impactful for you?
Oh, lot of people were and are super impactful for me. I think I'll give you a book that I like quite a bit that I encourage folks to read. It's called The Score Takes Care of Itself. By Bill Walsh, was the storied coach of the San Francisco 49ers, where the effort precedes the results, and a bunch of ways in which he liked his team to behave. And so that one always spoke to me in a really meaningful way, because the standard of performance, as he called it, was so clear. And I felt like it was aspirational in ways, and he even described it as such. So that one has always really stuck with me in a really meaningful way.
Yeah. Any individuals that you want to highlight, just out of curiosity?
Any individuals? I mean, this is going to sound cliche, but my mom, she passed away 2 days from now, a year ago, from pancreatic cancer. Yeah. And so she was always very much in my corner. And she encouraged me to do all of the things that were relatively high risk. She says, you could do it and you'll figure it out. And so she was a big impetus for me doing what it is I do today. And so I miss her a lot.
Yeah. It's so important to have the people who give you the support to have that philosophy, that I'll figure it out philosophy. Jump into whatever problem, figure it out, get whatever resource, whatever people you need, and identify ways that you do and accomplish it. And path A might not be right, and then you might get to path G, but along the way, you've learned a lot to know, the direction you want to go and what you've learned from it. So I love to hear that, and I love to ask that question, like I said, to highlight those individuals, or highlight the key things that motivate you and kind of influenced you. But last question is, I don't like to leave anything on the table. Is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have, or that you would have liked to answer? Anything come to mind?
Probably not. I don't think so. Maybe did I put this shirt on specifically for this? I did. Yes, I did.
I love that, Jeff. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you and learning not only about your career and your insight to what companies and programs that they're running and how they could be better, not only in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also how those metrics are so important for overall business outcomes, and really thinking about an organization holistically, and not only in capturing new business or in hiring new people, but also retaining people and keeping a cohesive and attractive environment. Last little bit is, where can we support you and find you as a founder? Give us your plugs. What are your websites, your LinkedIn, your Twitters? Where can we find you and be a big supporter of not only Dandi, but you, Jeff Fernandez?
Yeah, I appreciate it. Julian, thanks for having me. Find me on LinkedIn. Find Dandi on LinkedIn. Our website is Dandi, Dandi, DANDI.com. So reach out, follow us on LinkedIn, and check out our newsletter. I appreciate it.
Amazing. Jeff, I hope you enjoyed yourself, and thank you again for being on the show today.
Likewise. Thanks for having me, folks. Julian, cheers.
Of course.